say a word about the public buildings and holding roadblocks in parts of eastern Ukraine. It is clear that the leading elements of these forces, it is clear to us from their training, their equipment, their identical behavior to infiltrators in Crimea, are not simply pro-Russian forces. Parts of them have been Russian forces, not just pro-Russian. I think that is common sense, that is quite obvious. They have added to their strength with other recruits, and there are widespread and credible reports that many of these are actually hired thugs of one kind or another. They are not representative from what we have heard and seen of local people. There should be no doubt that the Russian government is trying to orchestrate conflict and provocations in the east and south of Ukraine, and that the immediate goal is the disruption of elections on the 25th of May, although of course they might also intervention. By using civilians as cover, these infiltrators present the Ukrainian government with a very difficult dilemma. The Ukrainian authorities have a duty, of course, to keep law and order, to restore law and order, but face extreme difficulty in doing so without harming civilians. We should recognize that problem, and we should also be clear-eyed that there is an enormous propaganda effort underway directed from the Ukrainian government. In such circumstances, I commend sincerely the restraint and the judgment that the government here in Kiev has shown throughout this crisis. The Ukrainian government has a responsibility to establish law and order and to protect the people of this country, but to do this while Russia is coordinating and instigating violence is immensely difficult, and it would be for any government. So I've come back to Ukraine today. I was here, as you know, 2 months ago. First of all, to show support unity of your country in demonstrating your determination to chart your own course, to make your own decisions. It has never been our argument in the United Kingdom or in other European Union countries that Ukrainians have to choose between East and West. We believe that it should be possible to have open trading relations with the European Union and to have good relations with Russia. There should be no contradiction between those things. It is the policies of Russia that have made that so difficult. And we support you making your own decisions in this country, as we do in ours, in a healthy democracy, through elections. I think it is important that the people of Ukraine demonstrate their support for that and their rejection of forces that are threatening to tear the country apart. I met yesterday evening Prime Minister Yatsenyuk again, and have now met, I think, 5 of the presidential candidates from across the political spectrum in Ukraine. I've also met some of you, some of the journalists, as well as the business leaders and representatives from civil society from across the varied regions of Ukraine. Everyone that I have met in Ukraine has expressed the same strong commitment to working for a united and successful country in the future. There is no doubt that your election on the 25th of May will be held in very testing circumstances, very difficult circumstances. In the face of unacceptable pressure to undermine those elections, I express my admiration for the presidential candidates taking part. Their refusal to be intimidated and their determination to take part in these elections is a sign of the strength be a successful, free and independent nation, able to choose for yourselves who you trade with, who you elect as your leaders, to be free to decide your own future. Of course, many people in this country, as in many other countries, will be dissatisfied with life. And people across this country, I'm sure, want more economic opportunity, better living standards. They want the rule of law. They want an end to corruption. Some people want more decentralized government as well. And people in this country, again, as in our country and other democratic countries, have the right to express their views on all of these issues. But a successful, prosperous, democratic future cannot be achieved by force, by taking up arms, or by organizing so-called referendums in parts of the country, again, to try to undermine the presidential elections. And these actions would only serve to take the country backwards. So I think that the elections on the 25th of May are an opportunity for a new period of inclusive government in Ukraine. Of course, they are just the beginning. Whoever wins the election will need to listen to and work for the interests of all the people of the country. They will also need the support of all the presidential candidates, including those who will have been defeated, from across politics to engage in a serious process of constitutional reform and national dialogue, to enact important reforms, to tackle corruption and secure the country's economic future, and to build stable relations with East and West. As part of the international community, we will provide monitors for the elections and other practical support for the elections. Europe, America, and all of Ukraine's friends will help. So I urge people in Ukraine to support those elections, to take part, to vote in them, so that the true voice of the Ukrainian people is heard loud and clear. This is an important opportunity for your country in very difficult times, and in any democratic country, making a success of an election and showing that the people's voice can be heard is the right thing to do. So thank you very much. These are my reflections on another 24 hours here, and I'm open to your questions.
Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask a question.
Hi, Philip Williams from ABC Australia. Mr. Hague, are you confident the elections can take place? What are the results to this? What are the consequences for this nation if they don't take place? And secondly, is Britain considering material support, military support for this country in the current climate?
Well, there's a great determination, I think, on the question of the elections going ahead. I feel, I've heard a great determination that these elections must go ahead. And I think I can feel that from the presidential candidates that I have met, of a variety of political views, as well as from the government, including many people from civil society and the media. Ukrainians have a right to determine their own future, to elect their own leader. And that is what these elections are about. And so a failure to hold those elections would be very, I think, and would show that a democratic election can be undermined. That would be a terrible blow for democracy. Held. So I think in the international community we should give our strong support, as I have tried to today, for those elections to go ahead on schedule. It's important for this decision to be made and for this major democratic event to take place. We are assisting in many ways. I have met the election observation mission this morning, which is going to be a very large one, as you know, with about 1,000 election monitors. Britain will supply a big proportion, maybe about 100 of those 1,000 election monitors. We're also supplying more people to take part in the OSCE special monitoring mission. The help that we're providing to Ukraine that you're asking about, we are helping with technical know-how. I announced when I was last here a budget to give in financial management in many areas of government. That is the sort of help that we give. It is not, as you know, direct military assistance. Okay?
Богдана Костюк, Radio Liberty. Sir, will Ukrainian soldiers to take part in the international military trainings which are to take part in Ukraine this year? Thank you.
I have had some discussions with the Ministry of Defense, and including with the Deputy Minister of Defense here today, and there are many ways in which we can work together in the future on training. And again, there are places in our military training colleges which can be made available for Ukraine, and we have a lot of defense reform that we can assist with. So those have been the things that we've been talking about rather than any particular exercises this year. Okay.
Дмитро Полонський, телеканал Євроньюз Україна. Наступного тижня міністр...
Helpful translation will... Oh, simultaneous translation will be provided.
Дмитро Полонський, телеканал Євроньюз Україна. Наступного тижня міністри закордонних справ Євросоюзу будуть збиратися, щоб обсудити санкції проти Росії. Наскільки серйозні будуть санкції від Великобританії і наскільки вони будуть такі схожі на ті, що...
Yes, we're in close coordination with the United States and with other European countries on preparing further sanctions on Russia. The UK has played a leading role in framing the sanctions that have been agreed so far. As you know, these have been on individuals, individuals associated with what has happened, particularly in Crimea and in creating unrest in the east of Ukraine, and on individuals in Crimea. We are doing more work in Brussels this week on preparing for further sanctions. We will be ready to impose those if necessary. Chancellor Merkel and President Obama set out the position last week, as you know, and they were speaking for Western nations in general on our approach. So we are preparing what has become known as the third tier of sanctions. These are more far-reaching measures covering economic and trade and financial areas. And we are not saying only that they are only imposed if there is a military invasion of Ukraine. Chancellor Merkel and President Obama set that out. But nor are we setting a red line, because if we do that, Russia can just go up to the red line, knowing that they can escape the sanctions. So we will have to assess over the coming days and weeks whether Russia is continuing to create instability. Certainly Russia is doing that now. And I will attend the meeting in Brussels on Monday and will argue very strongly that we should be fully ready with those additional sanctions. I want to make an additional point on this, which is that these sanctions are important, and they are affecting confidence in the Russian economy. We can see the flight of capital out of Russia, the fall of the stock market. But the very important thing for the Russian leadership to think about is the long-term consequences of this crisis. The G7 energy ministers are meeting this week. The United Kingdom is producing ideas. We are circulating them to our European colleagues on how to reduce over time the energy dependence of European nations on Russia. And I think the consequences of this crisis will be reduction of energy dependence. And already it has led to Russia's exclusion from the G8. It will lead some NATO nations to adopt increased defense expenditure. And at the NATO summit in the UK in September, Russia will lose economic and political influence in the world as a result of the violation of the sovereignty and territorial. Continue with this, the more they will lose that economic and political influence. For us to explain and to be understood in Moscow. Sorry, that is a long answer to your question.
Hi, Richard Carter from AFP. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Foreign Minister Lavrov said yesterday of Geneva talks unless the pro-Russian separatists, whatever you want to call them, take part. What's Britain's view on a potential Geneva 2? And secondly, is there still a fear that Russia could actually...
if you like, a follow-up to Geneva is that, yes, and indeed the United States, are completely open to diplomacy. Of course, we want de-escalation. That is our diplomatic objective here, and we want the tensions to be reduced. And is the main way to do that. So there is communication with Russia. Our Prime Minister spoke to President Putin a few days ago. I speak regularly to Foreign Minister Lavrov. But to make a meeting worthwhile, what it would really require is two things. A complete acceptance that Ukraine is entitled to have elections on the 25th of May, and that those should go ahead without external disruption. And second, we need a commitment from all involved in such a outcome. The problem last time, as I described earlier in my remark, one single step to implement what was agreed at Geneva. And yes, there were steps for Ukraine to implement, which Ukraine has got on with implementing. But there were other things for Russia to implement, given Russia's influence over illegal armed groups operating in eastern Ukraine. That influence. So I think the success of any such meeting depends on those. Lavrov said on military, on Russia's military intentions. It's hard to speculate. I said earlier that the objective of what Russia has been doing is clearly to disrupt the elections, and that it could be might be to provide a pretext for military intervention. But it is that is for them to speak about. That is not. It's hard for us to know. Okay, next question.
Next question, please.
Mr. Foreign Minister, Mr. Foreign Minister Michael Hammerschlag. Are you, Britain has been remarkably firm in their positions regarding all this. Do you feel yourself limited, or do you feel any pressure from the billions and billions of dollars Russia has invested in England in so-called Londonograd? And you know, is that ever a factor in your calculations?
No, is the answer to that, but just to expand on that. No, we are ready with the rest of the European Union, if necessary, to impose more wide-ranging sanctions, which would have to include measures in the financial sector. I think it would be important for all European nations to act together on this. Of course, trade has built up between Britain and Russia in recent years, as between many European countries and Russia. And indeed, the fact that there are British companies, a lot of it is the other way around from what you were saying, that British companies with big investments in Russia, and that our trade with Russia has increased in recent years, does demonstrate that you can have open trade with the rest of the European Union and do a great deal of trade with Russia. You know, we're in the European Union. But we have boosted our trade and investment with Russia in recent years. But I think for us and for all European nations, these major considerations we're speaking about here outweigh these things, these factors. We have a national interest in a rules-based international system. And in standing against violations of international law, of the UN Charter, of the territorial integrity of independent nations. And if we do not take action to defend those things, then there are much bigger things at stake than year-to-year variations in exports and investment with any one particular country. So the answer is that, the short answer is no, this is not a factor. There is no proposal for sanctions in the European Union that the United Kingdom has held back or vetoed or prevented. We are ready to play our part.
Foreign Secretary, as a moderator, I would like to ask you a last question. Osborne, the Minister of Exchequer, made a statement. He mentioned that Britain is considering allocating £500 million to Ukraine. And there was a big debate about that, whether Britain should support Ukraine. I mean, 2 months later, actually, almost 3 months later, what's the position of the British government in terms of helping Ukraine with reforms here, with curbing corruption, with economic reforms, judicial reforms? What's the current stance on that? Yes. The large sums you're talking about, I think you're referring to the part we play in the IMF, of course, and of course, the great bulk of international support is through an IMF program. It's important for the conditions of that to be observed. That is the main vehicle for international assistance. But there is also money available to Ukraine through European institutions, which Britain also joins in. And then in addition to that, we have some bilateral funds. These are smaller amounts, but they are a very important help. And I announced on my last visit a $16 million budget to help with technical expertise. That's very important because that is about financial management, about defeating corruption. Britain has a lot of experience in these things, so we can do a lot of that, and we can do more on that. If whoever wins the presidential election would like Britain to do so, I think we can do more on that in the future. It's also important, however, for the leadership to be here in this country, and I've discussed this with all of the presidential candidates I have met, to make sure that corruption is defeated, that there is the opportunity for people in this country to enjoy a new politics as well as a new economic situation. In which they know that everybody can be included, and in which foreign investors can invest with confidence, relying on the rule of law and knowing they will be fairly treated. So I think this election is important internationally for all the reasons we've described, but it's important. It's so important for the people of Ukraine because it's vital for that new politics, for that rooting out of corruption and effective economic and financial management to be introduced by the next administration in Ukraine. And that is really the best advice that I can give. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.